What if one man could hold the fate of an entire nation's economy in his hands? In the chaotic financial landscape of early America, J.P. Morgan did exactly that. Before the Federal Reserve existed, Morgan single-handedly performed the functions of a central bank during three major financial crises. Today's video maps the extraordinary rise of America's most influential banker and reveals how Morgan's power grew so vast that he could manipulate markets, crush competitors, and force even the U.S. government to play by his rules. If you've ever wondered how Wall Street gained such enormous influence over Washington, you're about to discover where it all began. In 1837, a financial catastrophe rippled through America's banking system. Hundreds of banks collapsed. Businesses shut their doors. Thousands lost their life savings. Among those watching was Junius Morgan, a successful merchant whose son, John Pierpont, would later transform this painful lesson into a blueprint for power. The Panic of 1837 revealed something crucial about America's financial system. Its inherent instability created opportunities for those willing to establish order amidst chaos. From the ashes of financial collapse, Morgan would emerge, with strategies designed to harness disorder for strategic advantage. J.P. Morgan entered banking during the 1850s as America transformed from farmland to factory. The Industrial Revolution demanded massive capital investments that America's fragmented banking system struggled to provide. While traditional banks focused on conservative, local lending, Morgan recognized the vacuum of central authority in American finance. No central bank existed to regulate markets or provide stability during crises. It was like an orchestra without a conductor, each section playing their own tempo, with no coordination. Morgan's vision extended beyond profit. He saw America's economic landscape as inefficient and dangerous. The nation's railroad system exemplified this problem, overbuilt, disorganized, and plagued by destructive competition. When the economic downturn of the 1870s pushed many railroads toward bankruptcy, Morgan launched his consolidation campaign. His Morganizations transformed failing enterprises into profitable ones through strategic restructuring. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad proved a prime example. Morgan acquired this bankrupt Northeastern line, installed loyal management, standardized equipment, and integrated it with other rail holdings to create a coordinated regional network. By 1890, Morgan controlled 5,000 miles of American railway, privatizing what today we would consider essential public infrastructure. His approach fundamentally altered American capitalism through ownership rather than mere financing. His firm demanded board seats, restructured management, and coordinated industry-wide policies. Morgan systematically targeted industries plagued by competition, acquired assets at depressed prices, eliminated competitors, and established centralized control. This template moved from railroads to steel, electricity, shipping, and eventually banking itself. When Andrew Carnegie's steel operations threatened Morgan's carefully managed railroad equipment supplies, Morgan bought Carnegie out, creating U.S. Steel, America's first billion-dollar corporation. Banking was no longer simply financing industry. It had become the controlling force behind industrial development. Financial interests now determined which industries would grow, which would consolidate, and which would perish. As Morgan's empire expanded through the 1880s and early 1890s, America's democratic institutions faced an unprecedented challenge. Unelected financial power increasingly controlled vital national interests. This tension would soon face its first major test during the Panic of 1893, when the government would discover just how dependent it had become on the bankers' empire. President Grover Cleveland stared anxiously at a Treasury report in February 1893. The nation's gold reserves had fallen below $100 million for the first time in American history, a psychological threshold that threatened to undermine confidence in the entire monetary system. At that time, America operated under the gold standard, meaning the value of the dollar was directly tied to gold. As reserves dwindled, investors feared the U.S. government might fail to meet its financial obligations. The Panic of 1893 unfolded with terrifying speed, becoming the worst economic crisis America had experienced to that point. Within months, over 500 banks suspended operations. More than 15,000 businesses declared bankruptcy. Unemployment climbed to nearly 20%. "We had no warning," wrote a Pennsylvania factory worker in his journal. "One day I had a job. The next, I joined thousands on the streets with nothing to feed my children. Unlike today, the federal government possessed no central bank to inject liquidity into the markets or adjust interest rates. The Treasury Department watched helplessly as gold continued flowing out of government vaults. The government couldn't print more money without corresponding gold reserves or provide emergency funding to failing banks. The president's options were severely limited by both law and convention. In the midst of the crisis, Cleveland discovered a cancerous growth in his mouth, requiring immediate surgery. Rather than revealing this health problem and potentially triggering further market panic, Cleveland arranged for a secret operation aboard a friend's yacht. Surgeons removed a significant portion of his jaw while the boat cruised New York Harbor. Even the nation's leader hid his vulnerability to maintain public confidence in an already fragile system. By February 1895, the Treasury's gold reserves had plummeted to just $41 million, placing the government on the brink of bankruptcy. With no options remaining, Cleveland summoned J.P. Morgan to the White House, a meeting that symbolized an extraordinary power shift. The elected leader of the United States was effectively admitting his government couldn't solve the crisis without a private banker's assistance. Morgan assembled a syndicate of bankers who agreed to provide the Treasury with 3.5 million ounces of gold, worth about $65 million. The terms revealed who held the real power. Morgan's syndicate would purchase government bonds at below-market rates and receive substantial commissions, guaranteeing significant profits regardless of market conditions. Public outrage erupted when the arrangement became known. Critics labeled it a sweetheart deal, transferring public wealth to private hands. Morgan maintained he had acted out of patriotic duty. Yet the episode demonstrated a troubling dynamic. Decisions affecting millions of citizens' economic welfare increasingly rested with private financial interests, rather than democratically accountable institutions. The Panic of 1893 established a precedent. In times of crisis, the government would turn to private financial interests for rescue, often on terms dictated by those same interests. This power dynamic would be tested again during the financial panic of 1907. The New York Stock Exchange plummeted by nearly 50% in October 1907 as panic consumed Wall Street. Stock tickers ran hours behind actual transactions, while terrified investors clamored to liquidate their holdings at any price. Amidst this financial chaos, the nation's attention focused on an ornate library at 219 Madison Avenue, the private residence of J.P. Morgan, now transformed into the war room of American economic survival. The crisis had begun weeks earlier, when F. Augustus Heinze and Charles W. Morse's copper market speculation scheme collapsed, triggering a chain reaction throughout the financial system. Depositors rushed to withdraw funds from Knickerbocker Trust Company, which had connections to the failed speculators. Like dominoes falling in sequence, the bank runs spread to other institutions across the country. Trust companies proved particularly vulnerable as they operated with fewer regulations and lacked adequate cash reserves. With President Theodore Roosevelt away on a hunting expedition and no central bank to inject liquidity, a 70-year-old private banker became America's last line of defense against economic collapse. Morgan's library, with its towering bookshelves and Renaissance artwork, became the command center. There he summoned the presidents of major financial institutions. There he assessed their conditions and determined which would receive emergency funding and which would fail based on his belief in preserving essential institutions while allowing inefficient firms to collapse. As conditions deteriorated, Morgan recognized only massive intervention could prevent wholesale collapse. In a decisive move, he convened bank presidents at 3 a.m. in his library. The doors clicked shut. Tension filled the room. Morgan refused to allow anyone to leave until they pledged $25 million to create a liquidity pool. Several bankers balked. Morgan leaned forward and declared, "This is where you prove your patriotism. The country's welfare demands it." By dawn, exhausted and pressured, the bankers had committed the required funds, sacrificing their institution's short-term interests for collective stability. Treasury Secretary Cortelyou arrived with $25 million in government funds, but effectively surrendered control to Morgan, allowing him to deploy public resources. When massive withdrawals threatened Trust Company of America, Morgan personally inspected their records, before publicly declaring the institution solvent, immediately calming depositors. Morgan's authority extended to public institutions. When he arranged a $30 million loan preventing New York City's default, he had functioned as a de facto central bank, determining which institutions survived and allocating capital across the economy through personal authority. The spectacle of one man exercising such vast power over millions' economic fate convinced even conservative leaders that systematic reform was necessary. Morgan, unilaterally deciding which companies survived, awakened public demand for democratic oversight. Ultimately, it led to calls for government intervention that would culminate in the Federal Reserve Act. In November 1910, a private rail car attached to the southbound Southern Railway train carried an unusual group of passengers. The men used aliases and avoided being seen together on the platform. Their destination, Jekyll Island, a remote sanctuary off the Georgia coast, shrouded in secrecy. The perfect setting for this clandestine summit, where the future of American finance would be redrawn. These weren't criminals fleeing justice. They were America's most powerful bankers, including Senator Nelson Aldrich, Assistant Treasury Secretary Piet Andrew, and representatives of Morgan's financial empire. Their mission emerged directly from the wreckage of the 1907 panic. The financial devastation had finally convinced even staunch opponents of central banking that America needed systematic reform. The spectacle of a private citizen, Morgan, rescuing the national economy had undermined faith in America's financial architecture. Conservative business interests acknowledged the existing system couldn't withstand another similar crisis. The question became, what form would a new system take, and who would control it? Two competing visions emerged. Progressive reformers advocated for a public institution with democratic accountability and government oversight, placing the money supply under public control. Morgan and his allies championed an alternative, a central bank that would appear governmental while remaining under banker control, providing stability while preserving their authority. At Jekyll Island, the banking establishment crafted their preferred solution, before public anger could force more radical reform. For 9 days, they drafted what would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act, a decentralized network of regional banks with a coordinating board, including significant banker representation. This structure created the appearance of government oversight while embedding private influence throughout the system. Their goal, to create a central bank that wouldn't look like a central bank. While this blueprint took shape, Congress launched the Pujo Committee to investigate the money trust, the network of financial control centered around Morgan. Investigators mapped the extraordinary reach of his empire, documenting how a small group controlled the American economy through interlocking directorates. When Morgan testified before the committee in December 1912, the 75-year-old financier faced hostile questioning about his firm's economic dominance. Defending his philosophy of financial power, Morgan insisted, "I do not believe that I could create or develop a money trust. Control lies in character and credit." The committee's final report revealed Morgan's firms held 341 directorships in 112 corporations, with combined assets equivalent to about half the entire gross national product of the United States. The Federal Reserve System that emerged in 1913 represented a compromise between banker interests and democratic reform. Morgan died in Rome on March 31, 1913, 9 months before President Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. Yet the system created in response to his power continues to shape America's economy today. September 2008, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke huddled with Wall Street executives in emergency meetings that mirrored Morgan's crisis management from a century earlier. As Lehman Brothers collapsed and financial markets froze, these modern financial leaders made decisions that followed Morgan's playbook, deciding which institutions would survive, which would fail, and how government resources would protect the system's core. The methods had evolved, but the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. While financial elites deliberated in Manhattan boardrooms, millions of Americans watched their homes slip into foreclosure. In neighborhoods from Cleveland to Phoenix, families packed their belongings into rental trucks, casualties of a financial system that prioritized institutional survival over community stability. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, But the machinery of financial influence he constructed outlived him by generations. His bank eventually transformed into J.P. Morgan Chase, surviving a century of mergers and regulatory changes to emerge as America's largest financial institution. The 2008 crisis demonstrated how Morgan's legacy institution gained strength through financial turmoil, absorbing Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, while smaller competitors disappeared. Like a river reshaping its banks, Morgan's consolidation strategies during earlier panics carved the landscape of modern finance. Throughout the 20th century, American democracy engaged in a continuous struggle with concentrated financial power. The New Deal banking regulations temporarily constrained Wall Street's influence. Glass-Steagall legislation separated commercial and investment banking, while the Securities and Exchange Commission imposed transparency requirements. Yet by the 1980s, deregulation dismantled these restrictions. The wall between commercial and investment banking fell in 1999, recreating the financial concentration Morgan pioneered. The institutional mechanisms sustaining this influence operate largely as Morgan designed them. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington ensures former bankers regularly staff key regulatory positions, while former regulators take lucrative jobs at financial institutions. Financial lobbying represents another dimension of Morgan's legacy, with Wall Street spending billions on political influence since 1998. The Federal Reserve itself reveals the persistence of Morgan's approach. Created to check private banking power, the central bank has repeatedly acted during crises to protect financial institutions at substantial public cost. During the 2008 crisis, the Fed provided $16 trillion in emergency loans to financial institutions. Financial concentration has increased since Morgan's era. The 5 largest banks now control assets equivalent to approximately 45% of GDP, creating a system where ordinary Americans bear the risks, while concentrated wealth captures the benefits. This consolidation has accelerated after each financial crisis. Morgan's lasting legacy is the blueprint he created for how financial power can capture government authority. The fundamental question remains unresolved. Was Morgan correct that financial stability requires concentrated private power? Or does true economic security demand democratic control of the financial system? The story of J.P. Morgan reveals something profound about American capitalism. Morgan didn't simply build a financial empire. He constructed a system where private bankers could effectively capture government authority during moments of crisis. This blueprint continues to shape our economic landscape a century later. The essential question is whether democratic societies should surrender economic sovereignty to unelected financial interests. When Presidents Cleveland and Roosevelt turned to Morgan, rather than democratic institutions, they established enduring precedents. As we navigate today's financial challenges, ask yourself, will you let private power dictate our collective destiny, or will you demand democratic accountability in our economic future?